Hi, I'm Chris from CodeReviewVideos.com, and in this video we're about to wrap up our wallpaper file upload process. So this stage, as we've seen in the previous few videos, we can now upload a wallpaper, the appropriate data is being stored, and in general things are behaving as we would like, with one noticeable exception, and that is that visually the form that we're using looks pretty ugly. So we've got this issue going on here where since we've swapped to using our own uploaded file type, the form itself seems to be indented somewhat. Also, it's not seen as required. We've got this empty thing added in for us. Things are a little bit weird. So before I look at one way of fixing this, I want to sort of preface this with an opinion, and that is that we're hitting on exactly the issue that originally forced me to look elsewhere than Twig when working with Symfony. So this is not really related to Symfony as such, it's PHP in general. My opinion is PHP is a pretty decent back-end language. It's not really very good at dealing with the modern front end. We end up working within its confines rather than allowing all the freedoms that we've come to kind of expect when working with like JavaScript or just plain old HTML. There's really no better place where this is illustrated, just how painful this can be, than when working with Symfony's form component. Now, for the longest time, I wasn't really aware that you could use Symfony's form component without ever really having anything to do with HTML. A lot of the stuff that we put into our form types, so if we take a look at a form type in our project to illustrate what I mean, are things that help render out the appropriate HTML. So for example here, the file type is going to ensure that on our rendered HTML, we get an upload field. Likewise, setting multiple here is going to ensure that the right attributes are set to ensure that a user can only upload one file rather than many. And there's a bunch of these, like you can look through Symfony's documentation and see just how many of these form field types there are, buttons and checkboxes, countries and whatnot. And these are all helpers to render out some nice HTML. But the thing is, forms are perhaps one of the most complex requirements, and as such there's a bunch of edge cases and stuff that's really hard to predict when coming up with like a generic library to solve this problem. So for me, detaching the concept of HTML from Symfony's form is really where most of the power lies. I don't care at all really in the real world about any of the stuff that Symfony does when it comes to generating HTML for forms because I don't use Twig. Now in the show notes to this video you will find a link to a course where we cover how to use Symfony with Angular and React versus this sort of old-fashioned approach of PHP rendering out HTML for you. I strongly encourage you to watch that series if you haven't done already, as it will completely eliminate one really problematic area of working with Symfony's form component, and that's the HTML element of it. So prior to the inclusion of our Symfony uploaded file class as a concept in our system, things were going pretty much okay. We'd go into app, config, easy admin bundle, and under here we had a property of file, which was a type of just file, label of file. But now we swap that out and we're using this uploaded file type. Now there's a really subtle difference as to what's happening here. All of the Symfony core types are seen as simple by Symfony. In other words, they're going to map to some sort of HTML element. So we can see this in action if we do on a Mac, Command and Shift and O, and then just type in any file name in the project. This is slightly different from just Command and O on a Mac where you could open up a particular class. This is going to let you find any file in the project inside PHP Storm. So form_div_layout is what we're actually after here. We browse to this, and this is how, when Symfony goes to render out our forms, they end up looking like HTML. And it's these three things that we're predominantly interested in at this stage. So as I say, like a file type or a text type, things like that, they're going to look to what that type is and then render out some sort of input related to that element. However, because we've defined our own uploaded file type, this is no longer seen as a simple form field. It's seen as compound. And so the most generic part of this whole process starts with this form_widget, and you can see if we're compound then we do one thing, otherwise we do the simple thing. So we've seen the simple thing, but if we look at the compound thing, then what it's trying to do is look to our form as though it were a subform. Now this is a little bit of a confusing concept, but it makes a bit more sense if you give it some sort of context. So say we had a form and we have three fields on there, or first name, last name and age. It's a really simple form. Each of those fields would be considered to be simple. They might be two text types and an integer type. Now say that form maps to an entity called person. At this point, life is pretty good. It's quite straightforward. Adding a new person or editing an existing person is quite straightforward. We only need this one form. And then, as ever, the business requirements change. Or perhaps you was just early on in the project or whatever. But let's think about it from a slightly bigger perspective. Say we're organising a concert or something along those lines, and we're trying to capture attendees. Now, bear with me as this is a slightly contrived example. But say you had another form that was called concert or something, which allowed you to enter the name of the concert, but then you wanted to add one or more of these persons to be registered to attend the concert. So you might have some mechanism of JavaScript adding in HTML to represent the form that allows you to add a new person. And you want to do that repeatedly. But for each one of those persons, you want to reuse that same form type. It's only ever got those 3 fields. You don't want to be in a situation where you've got one form with like person_1 or first name _1, last name _1, age _1, and then first name _2, last name _2, and so on. You don't obviously want to get into that position. So instead, your concert type, your form for the concert would have its name, and then it would have an embedded collection of persons. And for each one of those persons, you would reuse the person type. Now, in that situation, this would probably be beneficial. And I've actually got a video series on this very problem on the site, which again, I will link to in the show notes. As it's quite a confusing subject, honestly, but it's a lot easier to see when you look at it visually. However, in our case, as best I understand it, we've basically confused the way our form is being rendered. And it's nothing really to do with the form itself. It's to do with the way that we're rendering through layers of Bootstrap and Twig templates and stuff. So let's jump back to our HTML and take a look if we inspect at what is actually happening here. So take the full outer wrapper, which is this. So things start off quite well. If we just close that one down, you can see we have a very similar setup here for our slug. It's where we get a little bit further in that things start to get messy. So we're using Bootstrap's 12-column grid, and we're saying even on the very smallest screens, we want this to take up 12 columns. In other words, be full screen. And there's nothing really related to what we're doing. It's just because we're using Bootstrap. I just wanted to flag that up. And again, form group is some Bootstrap stuff. A field uploaded file is actually a Symfony thing. It's to do with the name of our form type. Our form type is called uploaded file type, which is why we've got this field -uploaded_file. It misses off the type bit, but that's basically where it's coming from. If you changed that file name, that would also change. Notice also it's a class, not an ID. That's important, as you may have more than one upload field on your form, potentially. So next we have standard label. It's taking up 2 of the 12 columns, which leaves us with 10 left. So far, so good. Now where things get weird is internally or inside this div, we're now thinking that we're working with a collection. Yet we aren't working with a collection. We just have this one file that's set on our entity, which is, a little bit strange. As a result of that, we end up with this crazy looking div, which contains this data empty collection attribute, which again contains a bunch of HTML that if you think back to the concert approach, what this might contain is a way to add the form that contains the HTML for the first name, last name, and age. Again, I urge you to watch that video that I've recommended in the show notes, as it just explains this very problem in a lot more detail. And it's completely free as well. So avoiding all that seems like it would be a good thing to do, as it's just pointless anyway. But where things get even stranger is that inside this 10-column div, we've got yet another div with another form group in it. And this is because it thinks it's part of a collection, so it thinks there might be multiple of these. And then inside that, we've got our 2-column label, and then again, our 10-column input. And interestingly, we know this works, and what Symfony is going to rely on is the name of this input. So we can see it's going to be part of the wallpaper form. It's expecting a file property, and under there can be many files. So it's like an array. So this becomes really important when we want to create our own field type to get rid of some of this stuff. So ultimately, what we're going for here is to delete that. And then if we delete that as well, then maybe that looks a little bit more like what we're after. We kind of don't need this weird collection thing going on either, except if we delete that, then we're going to delete anything below it. We can't really do that. Now I want to point out that this is not a problem of Easy Admin Bundle. This is a wider issue that's been going on for quite a while with Symfony. It actually affected a course that I did ages ago on Bootstrap and saw the same issue. And unfortunately, the pull request that was open back then is still open now. And I wish I had a solution to this problem. I'd imagine it's quite a complicated thing to solve. Otherwise, it would have been solved by now by people a lot smarter than me. Anyway, with all that talk out of the way, let's look at one way of fixing this. So we can see that we've got this form widget simple. It might be nice to take a copy of this and do our own thing with it. So I'm going to come up with my own view, which I'm going to call in the form directory, the image upload html.twig. I'm going to paste that in. Don't need to set the type. It's always going to be a known type of file. I mean, that's just standard HTML. Then we've got this block, widget attributes, and then we've got some stuff about a value. Well, don't really need to worry about that when it's a file. Now we can come back to this and make some further changes, but for the moment, that should be good enough. Now to make use of this, we need to jump into our config YAML. Under our Twig configuration, we need to add in a new form themes section, and our form theme is going to be form image upload html.twig. Now has that changed anything at all? Well, let's give it a refresh and see. No. Now why it hasn't changed anything is because if we look inside our image upload, we're still talking about the form widget simple, and that's not what we want to be trying to override here. We're talking about a form type called uploaded file type. By convention, the widget that goes with this when this is attempted to be rendered by Twig will look for a more specific widget which matches up to the file name. So in this case, it would be loaded file widget, making sure to end the block as well. You don't really need the end block on there. You can just have end block. But because I've copied and pasted it, might as well update it. So did that make any difference? Yes, it has done. Let's inspect our element. And there's a critical problem here in that our wallpaper file is improperly nested. In other words, if we try and submit this now, let's just try anyway. So say Solano Beach, any slug, we'll save it off. You see the value is not valid. We check out why. I'll just get rid of this for the moment so we can actually see. We can see this value is not valid caused by a constraint violation on our file field. And we can see compound forms expect an array or null on submission. Kind of weird. But essentially what's happening here, as best I understand it, is we're passing through our file, but it's not in an array format. So again, it does matter that we need to see this stuff. So we do need to inspect to understand what's happening here. So what we want to do is change this back now to be wallpaper file like that, file. No speech marks or anything, but that is what we need. I'm curious now, if I try this again, will it work? Even though I've cheated. So let's just save that off. That's pretty magic. As long as our HTML is behaving the same way that our form, when we submit back, expects it to behave, then things should be good. Okay, so I'm going to delete that now because if I try this again, then it's going to moan that the image name is already in use or something along those lines. That's a problem that we've just not got to yet. And I also need to make sure that I've deleted the image as a result as well. Okay, we will get to fixing that problem when we come to doing the delete portion of this wallpaper management section. Okay, so obviously we can't rely on our user to go in and manually edit some HTML to make this work, but we don't want to have to do too much to make this work either. Like, you could feasibly probably come up with a bunch of solutions to this problem, JavaScript being like one that comes to the forefront of your mind, or it does in my case. But instead what we can do is we can change things at the view layer inside our uploaded file type. So when Symfony goes to build this view, what if we change the name that we're about to use there instead? So I'm going to do Command and M and override a method, and I'm going to override the build view method. Now, there's a bunch of stuff there that PHP Storm has thrown in for me around parent build view. I'm just going to leave that in. Then I'm going to do 3 dump statements, one for view, one for form, and one for options. And then I'm going to refresh the page. Now what that's going to do is dump out all the data that's in those 3 variables. So let's have a look at what that is. So let's just see if I can close that a little bit. So again, we dumped out the view, the form, the options, the view, the form, and the options. So what we're looking for here is something around that wallpaper open brackets file setup that we've got going on. So straight away, inside the view, we can see that we've got this full name property, which looks spot on. Now, if we didn't find what we're after here, of course, we could keep clicking through and hoping that we'd find some stuff in there that matches up. But as we've got it, we're going to need to go to the view, the vars, and then the full name. But before we do that, let's just see if we can hard code this first. So we'll say view, vars, and then we got this full name. And so maybe in here we could just say wallpaper, file. Again, no speech marks. Let's just give this a shot. Give that a refresh whilst it's doing that. Let's bring that up a touch. You can see now we've got what we're after in here, just to see if we can fake that off again. Let's just add some ones in. You can see our ones are added in. So if we think on a little bit, maybe there's a possibility that we want to use this upload file type, form field type in places other than just our wallpaper. I know it's potentially a sort of a premature thing to think about, but if we can do this easily, then why would we not? So instead, what I'm going to do is, as we know already that the full name is going to contain that wallpaper open brackets file close brackets, then we could concatenate that existing value with what we want it to be. So in other words, whatever it is, and then just stick file on the end. So give that a refresh, and things are still looking pretty good. So I'll just get rid of them dump statements before I forget. Last time, just refresh that, and we'll try it again. I think we should be good with Solano Beach. In fact, before I do that, let's set this file to be a required field, because I've missed that. So under Easy Admin Bundle, we can likely get rid of the label because it's going to be guessed from the name of the field. We'll just pass in some type options here, and we'll say this is going to be required true. That should be good enough. Let's give that a refresh. And now we got our dot to say that we are a required field. Excellent. So we'll say Solano Beach, Solana, that'll do. Save that off. And excellent, things are looking pretty good. Now, in truth, I'm kind of with you if you're thinking this was a completely ridiculous amount of work when we did this in 2 videos and it's taken us about 6 or maybe more videos to achieve the exact same thing. And honestly, it opens up a massive can of worms, and it's a discussion that I quite enjoy having, honestly. But for the sake of it, I'm going to keep the lid on that can of worms for the moment, as we've still got all the edit and delete stuff to do.